Hi everybody, this is Byron Jacobs for dmbpoker.com looking at another 100 NL hand. In this particular instance I am on the button with the hand King 10 off. It's folded round to me and I make an open to 2.25x and get called by both the blinds. We take a flop of 2-8-10 rainbow, obviously quite a good one for me, giving me top pair and almost top kicker, but not quite. And then suddenly and slightly unexpectedly, the villain in the small blind leads out for $2, which is a very small lead, slightly under 1/3 of pot. The big blind calls, and now it's down to me with the King 10. Now the villain's lead here in the small blind for the $2 is such a strange play. It's slightly hard to put him on a range, but if I had to, and I remember thinking at the time, I thought he either had like a weak 10, like a 10-9 or a 10-jack, maybe a 10-queen, or he had one of the two straight draws like the 9-jack or the 9-7. I thought those hands were likely. I didn't think it was very likely I was behind here because hands like 10-ace and jacks plus should all be 3-betting pre-flop, so I thought those hands were not very likely, and it was pretty, not 100% certain, but it was pretty likely here that the King 10 with top pair, very good kicker, was the best hand. I think villain 2 has kind of like almost anything. Like he's getting a very good price to call, so he could have a hand as weak as like 8-7 or something, or even a couple of overcards, especially if it's Jack Queen to give the gut shot draw as well. So I was fairly comfortable that I was ahead of his range, and so therefore I decided to raise to $10, which is maybe in retrospect a little bit on the small side. I should maybe have made this a little bit bigger. Both to extract value and to protect. After I make this raise, the villain in the small blind calls fairly quickly, and the big blind, as we suspected without much of a holding, folds straight away. So now we take the turn heads up, and a 7 comes. This obviously completes the straight for 9-jack, but is otherwise unlikely to be helpful to the villain in the small blind. The villain in the small blind now checks, and I'm quite happy to make a value stroke protection bet here, as I think if I get check raised here, I'm just done with the hand straight away. So I made a bet here of $16, which is slightly over half pot. I think this is something like 55–60% of the pot, and the small blind called this bet. I do remember toying with the idea of making a smaller bet here. Interestingly, I've noticed this is something that Snowy likes to do more often than I'd expect, is to make some bet like quite unexpectedly small, like a quarter or a third of the pot. Now I have sort of mixed feelings about a bet like that, because obviously if the small blind has a hand like 10-jack or 10-9, it's not really protecting my hand because the size isn't big enough and he's comfortably getting good enough odds to call. Whereas when I size it up a bit like I do here, at least I'm extracting value from that part of his range because he's not getting the right odds to call. He will have maybe like 9-10 out, something like that, and he's not quite priced in here. But I have noticed that nevertheless Snowy does like making these smaller bets in these situations, and I'm not 100% sure why it favours this line of play. Maybe so that you can get away cheaply when you get check raised or something. I'm not quite sure. Anyway, I think I'm good here, like almost always when villain only calls this bet. And then a 2 comes on the river, which is like the perfect card really, because even if he happened to have 8-7, which I think is unlikely, I've now outdrawn him. And now villain surprised me by leading out half pot, which completely confused me, and there was just no way I was ever going to fold this hand. But I do remember stopping and thinking, not because I had any intention of not calling, but I was just trying to work through what I thought his range might be here. I decided that he probably had a hand like 10-jack, 10-queen, or maybe just the stone bluff that had somehow gone wrong, although it's hard to see what kind of bluffing hand could completely miss here. I mean, maybe Jack-queen would be possible, but I don't think that calls the raise on the flop. Anyway, I called down, and villain shows up with a pair of jacks, which beats me, and I never had in his range at all, obviously, because I would certainly expect him to 3-bet this pre-flop, and I'd have thought it was quite a bad mistake not to 3-bet that hand pre-flop from the small blind. However, it does occur to me that because he played the hand in such a way that I could never really put him on the hand that he had, he ended up extracting a lot of value. I mean, maybe that's just because in this particular case the board ran out in such a way that it enabled him to get maximally paid off. So maybe the situation is that although his play is going to be very poor on a lot of other boards, his play is going to work out very badly, I should say, on a lot of other boards. This was this one particular instance where the style of his play with the slightly deceptive holding of the jacks, which I didn't expect him to have, got paid off maximally, whereas it may not have done in many other circumstances. Anyway, let's see what Snowy has to say about all this. So I've keyed in the hand here, and it starts off with me raising to 2.25, which Snowy is okay about, but wants to raise pot sized. I don't think it's a big deal one way or another. What does it say about the pot sized bet? Yeah, this is one of these situations where Snowy does something I don't understand. It wants to bet pot sized, but when you click on the pot sized bet, it gives an EV which is lower than the half pot bet that I made. So anyway, never mind. That's not the main feature of the hand. Obviously, he doesn't like the call with the jacks, much preferring the raise. But you know, we'd know that anyway. And player 3 calls, and then the lead out. Snowy seems to think is kind of like okay. Doesn't really feel strongly one way or another about that. Player 2 calls, and Snowy, happy with my raise, thinks I should be raising 100% of the time here. Wants me to raise bigger, which yeah, I suspected when I made the bet. I thought that maybe going to 10 wasn't quite big enough, and I should have maybe gone 12 or 14. I remember thinking about that. Player 2 calls with the jacks. That's obviously fine. Player 3 folds. And then player 2 checks, and Snowy totally happy with that. Snowy does not like my bet on the turn, doesn't like this at all, says this is no, shouldn't be doing this, wants to check 100% of the time. And if I do bet, yeah, this was what I mentioned in the earlier analysis, he wants me, if I do bet here, to bet very small, which is something, like I said, I don't really understand, because it doesn't protect against the kind of hands that he could easily have. And it opens me up to a check raise, so I'm not really sure what the purpose of that bet is. But anyway, that's something that Snowy seems to like to do in these situations. Obviously, player 2 calls here, and that's fine with the jacks. And then when it pairs off to 2 on the river, and Snowy leads, sorry, not Snowy, the villain from the small blind leads. Snowy says this is wrong. And I'm kind of inclined to agree, because I think, you know, when I raise the flop and bet the turn and nothing changes on the river, I'm gonna bet the river a lot of the time anyway. So I don't think there's any need for this lead out. And obviously I call, and Snowy thinks, yeah, it's fine to call. But Snowy actually wants to fold here quite a lot. He thinks that it's one of these odd situations where he thinks the EV of all 3 plays is more or less the same, which I don't really understand how that can be the case. But anyway, he doesn't seem to think it's a mistake to do anything here, and he thinks folding is quite reasonable, which surprises me, because I'm not folding here ever. So anyway, interesting hand based on the fact that my opponent obviously played in a rather unorthodox way, but in this particular instance ended up winning a decent sized pot due to that. So be interested to hear what John makes of all this. This has been Byron Jacobs for dmbpoker.com. Thanks for listening.
Hello, this is Jonathan Little. And I think the first decision point you actually have is on the flop. Clearly, your pre-flop play is perfectly fine and standard. And I definitely do agree that you should raise here. There is a pretty good amount of value in just raising and getting called by worse tens, by straight draws. Also, if you price out the gut shots, that's not really the end of the world. So I definitely like the idea of raising, and I probably would have gone 12 in this spot, but I certainly would not fault you for 10. So on the turn, I think you're not quite realizing how bad the 7 is. If you think about the range that your opponent's going to call your flop bet with, it's going to be a lot of 10s, which you do crush. Then it's going to be a lot of straight draws. So the very obvious straight draw, Jack 9, got there, right? And, you may think that your opponent's not going to call from before the flop with a hand like Jack 9, because Jack 9's not a great calling hand, but a lot of people do. And so that's a good reason not to bet. Also, 8-7 got there, 10-7 got there. So this card in particular is quite bad. Also, a 9 is pretty bad, and a Jack is pretty bad. So I think on those cards, Poker Snowy will tell you to check. A Queen's also probably pretty bad. So Queen, Jack, 9, 7 are all cards that you will... that I imagine Poker Snowy is going to tell you to check behind. The main reason Poker Snowy is would like a small bet in this spot if it is going to bet, and why you are seeing it suggesting a small bet in these situations is because if the turn was something like a 5 or lower, or a king, or an ace, those are all pretty bad cards for your opponent. And if he does have a draw, now he is, you're giving him slightly worse than the correct equity to call, or, really even break even if Snowy's telling you to bet, very, very, very tiny. But if your opponent does have a worse made hand, then he's drawing very thin. So that's why it doesn't mind a small bet. Like you mentioned, though, it does open you up to getting check raised, and I don't really know what it would suggest you do when you get check raised. This hand is probably just going to be a bet with the intention of fold if you get raised, but that certainly does open you up to being in a dicey spot, as you suggest. But again, those cards, Queen, Jack, 9, 7, are all quite bad for you, and that is definitely why it's going to suggest to check behind on those. So you do bet, and the opponent calls. And then on the river, when facing the lead, like you mentioned, I think this is just a pretty easy call. We discussed this in some of the previous situations where Poker Snowy suggested calling and folding some portion of the time with what seems to be a relatively strong hand. And that's just because if the opponent's balanced, it doesn't really matter what you do so much. But this hand is almost certainly good enough to call. But like I just said, I actually don't think you're beating a lot here. You thought your opponent was value leading a decent amount of the time, and that seems kind of tough for me to think that he is going to do. I would frequently expect to be shown better made hands like 10-8, 10-7, 8-7. Although actually, you know what? You lose to 8-7, so maybe just 10-8 and 10-7. Also, I would expect to see some hands like Queen Jack. I think that's a very obvious bluffing hand. And then also perhaps hands like King Queen of Hearts. That's the hand that actually makes some logical sense if your opponent's not going to 3-bet it before the flop. So that's certainly what I expect to happen in this spot, but like you said, calling seems pretty easy. One thing you did mention is that calling pre-flop ended up winning your opponent a lot more than he typically would have won, but I think that has a lot to do with the fact that you just flopped a hand that he barely beats. The Jacks is going to end up either getting out-flopped or outplayed a ton of the time by calling. And when you're out of position, you want to make the stack to pot ratio smaller because as stacks get smaller, the player in position loses some of their edge. So even though this worked out for your opponent great this time, I don't think it is going to work out for him too well in general. Interestingly, on the river, if he checks, you should certainly bet. Again, I would think. Once he checks calls the turn, you can discount the better hands a lot. I mean, like I said, you don't expect him to have jacks here. So I think you actually have a value bet on the river, probably a small one. So that's an interesting spot where if he checks, he's going to at least get some money out of you while also inducing bluff. So even though the lead worked out great this time, I don't know if it's going to work out most of the time. Thank you very much for watching. This has been Jonathan Little for dnbpoker.com.